Carl Jung once spoke of a transformation so profound and so disturbing that he considered it one of the most difficult human evolutions he had ever witnessed. He wasn't talking about ordinary changes like learning resilience or overcoming trauma. He was documenting something far deeper, an inner shift that turned gentle, sensitive souls into what I call awakened empaths. For decades, Jung noticed the same strange phenomenon. Many of his patients arrived fragile, withdrawn, and endlessly forgiving. They were people who had spent their entire lives as emotional sponges, absorbing the anger, dysfunction, and chaos of those around them. They apologized for existing. They blamed themselves for other people's failures. They covered bruises with excuses and carried depression like a hidden weight. On the surface, these patients looked like victims. But Jung began to realize they were something else entirely. Because they weren't just enduring pain. They were studying it. Every insult, every betrayal, every silent manipulation. They recorded it, not on paper, but in the deepest parts of their memory. They learned the patterns of abusers like chess players memorizing every move on the board. Jung eventually understood. What looked like fragility was actually observation. What looked like weakness was an extraordinary form of intelligence. And then, something would happen. Something that broke the spell. Almost always, it came in the form of betrayal, a lover's deception, a friend's manipulation, a family member's ultimate disloyalty. At that moment, everything changed. But not in the way most people expected. They didn't collapse. They didn't beg. They didn't rage. Instead, they grew eerily calm. This was the moment Jung recognized as the beginning of shadow integration, the instant when empathy and awareness fused with suppressed strength. The empath stopped pretending. They stopped silencing themselves. And with surgical precision, they began revealing what they had seen all along. This wasn't revenge. It was clarity. For the first time, the empath used their gift, not to excuse people's behavior, but to expose it. They spoke truth without hesitation, without cruelty, without fear. And Jung realized something chilling. He wasn't sitting across from victims anymore. He was sitting across from psychological visionaries, people whose ability to read others bordered on genius. Jung observed that the shift was not dramatic on the outside. The awakened empath didn't suddenly shout or storm out of rooms. No, what made them so powerful was their silence. A silence that unsettled everyone who once had power over them. Where they used to apologize, now they paused. Where they once sought approval, now they simply watched. And in that stillness, people around them began to unravel. Because for the first time, the manipulator, the narcissist, the abuser, was being seen clearly. Not attacked, not insulted, exposed. This exposure was devastating, because it carried no anger, only truth. The empath would calmly describe behaviors, patterns, lies, and betrayals with such precision that the guilty could no longer hide. Jung noticed that many abusers, when confronted this way, would react violently, not physically, but emotionally. They would lash out, accuse, gaslight, anything to regain control. But the awakened empath no longer took the bait. They understood the game. They had studied it in silence for years. And now, they simply stepped outside of it. That was their greatest power. Not revenge, not punishment, but freedom. For the first time, the empath began to live without carrying the pain of others. They learned that compassion without boundaries is self-destruction. They realized that saying no is not cruelty, it is clarity. And slowly, their energy shifted. The same people who once saw them as fragile began to feel uneasy in their presence. Why? Because awakened empaths radiate something rare, truth without fear. They are not easily manipulated. They are not easily fooled. And most dangerous of all, they cannot be controlled. Jung wrote that once this transformation occurs, it is irreversible. The empath does not go back to blindness. They cannot return to the days of silent suffering. It is, in a sense, a kind of rebirth. But unlike most rebirths, this one comes not with joy, but with fire. To Jung, these awakened empaths represented more than just healed patients. He saw in them the seeds of what humanity could become if people faced their shadows rather than ran from them. They embodied the union of compassion and clarity, of love and discernment. They didn't stop caring, but they cared wisely. And that wisdom frightened people, because it meant the empath could see not only what others did, but why they did it. Imagine looking at someone who lies to you, and instantly recognizing the childhood wound behind it. Imagine watching someone manipulate and knowing exactly which fear drives their behavior. Imagine seeing not just the mask, but the wound beneath it. That is what the awakened empath carries. It is a gift, yes, but also a burden. Because once you see with this clarity, it becomes impossible to unsee. Jung believed the awakened empath was one of the most important figures of the modern world, not because they are saints, but because they are truth-tellers. Their life teaches us a universal lesson, that real strength is not about domination or control, but about the courage to see clearly and act with integrity. They remind us that kindness without wisdom is exploitation, that forgiveness without accountability is self-betrayal, and that empathy, when awakened, becomes the sharpest form of intelligence. So if you have ever been called too sensitive, if you have carried the weight of other people's chaos, if you have been betrayed and broken but somehow stood back up, understand this. You are not weak. You are not naive. You are awakening. And one day, when the silence comes over you, when the calm arrives, when the patterns suddenly make sense, you will realize the truth Jung saw in his patience. You were never just an empath. You were always a visionary in the making.